Building a new capital has always been a powerful political move from ancient times to today. In the modern world, leaders who undertake such projects are often seen as authoritarian. For example, President Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan faced criticism for relocating his country's capital. Such a decision disrupts the lives of government officials, pulling them away from their homes and families. It also creates logistical challenges for foreign diplomats, who must find new housing, hire staff, and adapt to a new location. The costs are immense. In 1998, Kazakhstan spent more than $500 million to build its new capital, Astana. Throughout the long history of the ancient Mediterranean, several rulers established new capitals, but interestingly, relatively few did so before the era of Alexander the Great and his successors. When a king did take such a step, it was a significant event, remembered for generations, sometimes even as a stain on their legacy. In Mesopotamia, the great Sargon of the 24th century BCE was celebrated for his accomplishments for over 1,000 years, yet his decision to found a new capital, Agada, eventually came to symbolize arrogance and overreach. That makes it all the more notable that during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, several rulers across the eastern Mediterranean created new capital cities. Most of these rulers even named their cities after themselves, something earlier kings rarely dared to do. We know of such new capitals in Elam, Babylonia, Assyria. There may have been others as well, but these are the ones that have been uncovered through archaeology, though not all are equally well studied. Despite the differences in excavation, the cities share many characteristics. The second ruler known to have founded a new capital city was Akhenaten of Egypt, reigned 1353 to 1336 BCE, whose case has just been discussed in detail. His city, however, was unusual in that it wasn't named after him, but after his favored god. While religious devotion may have driven Akhenaten's decision, the project required significant political authority and ambition, and its effects were far-reaching. Sometime before Akhenaten, the Babylonian king Kurigalzu, I moved the royal court from the ancient city of Babylon to a new city named after himself, Dur-Kurigalzu, meaning fortress of Kurigalzu. The ruins of this city stretch along a 2-kilometer area near the Akarkuf Depression, a low-lying basin that channels overflow from the Euphrates River. Only a small part of the city has been excavated. The most prominent surviving structure is the core of a ziggurat or temple tower, which still stands near modern-day Baghdad. Nearby, archaeologists have identified a religious complex with at least 4 temples, along with a large palace area. Dur-Kurigalzu served as the royal residence for over a century, till later kings eventually moved back to Babylon in the 13th century BCE. 3 powerful rulers in the eastern Mediterranean also founded new capitals named after themselves, abandoning older centers of power. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta, i.e., ruled 1243 to 1207 BCE, established Kartakulti-Ninurta harbor of Tukulti-Ninurta just 3 kilometers north of the ancient capital, Assur. Perched on the floodplain across the Tigris River, the new city rose in a place where no prior settlement had existed. Though its full size remains uncertain, the city stretched at least 3 kilometers along the river. At its heart was a walled inner city covering 60 hectares, which contained 2 palaces, a ziggurat, and a temple dedicated to the god Ashur. Inscriptions found at the site quote Tukulti-Ninurta as saying he founded the city at Assur's request. Then the god Assur, my lord, asked me to establish a cult center across from my city, the one chosen by the gods, and he commanded me to build his sanctuary. So, by his command, I built before my city, Assur, a city for the god Assur, across the Tigris, in fields and meadows where no house had stood, no ruins had formed, and no bricks had ever been laid. I named it Kartakulti-Ninurta. Like other such projects, the city's fate was tied closely to its founder. When Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated in his later years, the city lost its political importance. Subsequent kings returned to Azor. Kartakulti-Ninurta became a relatively minor city within the Assyrian realm. Around the same time, Keulim, built of Elam, built all Untashna-Parisha, or city of Untashna-Parisha, as is new. Capital about 35 kilometers south of the traditional center at Susa, while the full extent of the city is unclear. It included a walled inner zone of about 100 hectares. In the northeast, at a palace complex, while at the center of the city, rose a massive ziggurat surrounded by many shrines. Thousands of inscribed bricks found in the temple tower record Untashna-Parish as the builder. The inscriptions suggest that he built temples for about 25 different gods, leading many scholars to believe that the city was meant to celebrate the unification of Elam, bringing together religious traditions from both the highlands of Anshan and the lowlands of Susa. The main ziggurat, for instance, was dedicated to Naparisha of Anshan and Inshushianik of Susa. Yet, like the other royal capitals of this period, the project was left unfinished. Construction stopped after the king's death, following a gap in our historical records. Later, Elamite rulers returned to Susa. The final example of a newly built capital also comes from Egypt and may have been the most ambitious of them all. Ramesses II, who ruled from 1274 to 1213 BCE, created his royal residence, Per-Ramesses, meaning House of Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta. The city sprawled across an area of about 1,000 hectares. One historian, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, once called it probably the vastest and most costly royal residence ever erected by the hand of man. Because of its immense scale, Per-Ramesses absorbed older cities, including Avaris, the former capital of the Hyksos rulers from 3 centuries earlier. Its size and location spread out over fertile farmland and lower Egypt make it impossible to fully reconstruct the city's layout, so archaeological work has focused on specific areas. These excavations have revealed numerous temples, palaces, stables, and workshops. Per-Ramesses was clearly an impressive sight, and ancient Egyptian texts speak of it with awe and admiration. I have arrived at Per-Ramesses' beloved of Amun and found it in excellent condition. It is a district like no other, modeled after Thebes. Re himself founded it. The residence is delightful to live in its countryside, abounds in every good thing, and it is well provisioned each day. Its ponds are full of fish, its pools teeming with birds, its granaries overflow with barley and emmer. Its ships sail out and return, bringing food and supplies each day. Joy lives there, and no one says, "I wish I had something more," despite its splendor. Per-Ramesses may have served more as a religious and ceremonial center than as the actual seat of government. That role likely remained with Memphis, where the kings were buried. This may help explain why, not long after Ramesses II's death, Per-Ramesses began to decline in political importance. The nearby city of Tanis eventually took over many of its functions. Per-Ramesses continued to exist until the 8th century BCE, when parts of it were dismantled. Looking at these 5 cities from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, we find some striking similarities. They were all enormous, built quickly and strongly, tied to the identity of their founders, who often named the cities after themselves or in one case after a personal deity. The cities were frequently described as having been built on untouched land, emphasizing their fresh start rather than being extensions of existing settlements. Each one featured a central district with temples and palaces, forming the heart of the royal and religious presence. Asterisk, however, none of these cities proved to be lasting political capitals. Most of them lost their importance or were abandoned soon after their founder's death, revealing how closely their fate was tied to the ruler who had envisioned them. The very existence of the new capital cities, founded during the late Bronze Age, reveals a great deal about the power wielded by Nemoka kings at that time. These construction projects were so vast that they must have drawn on the full resources of the state. Throughout history still today, rulers have used grand building works to showcase their authority and immortalize their names. In fact, 4 of the 5 kings we've discussed embedded their names directly into the names of the cities they founded. Clearly, they had no intention of these capitals being short-lived. Each of them ruled in lands with cities that had stood for centuries and they likely hoped their new creations would enjoy a similar longevity. These cities also offer insights into the nature of kingship in the period. We should be cautious not to view kingship in the ancient Near East as a fixed and uniform institution across all cultures and times. Our understanding is especially influenced by Egyptian sources, which are by far the most abundant. Even within Egypt, however, kingship evolved and faced challenges during the New Kingdom. Despite this, certain fundamental traits of kingship remained constant and were shared across much of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The new capitals give us a glimpse into how these traits were expressed. Urban historians have long noted that a city's layout reflects the worldview of those who design it. When building a new city or even a new neighborhood, planners have more freedom to express their ideals as they are not constrained by existing structures. Except for Per-Ramesses, all of the capitals discussed here were deliberately built on empty land. As Tukultina Nurdai put it, they were established where no house or dwelling had stood. These blank landscapes gave rulers complete control over the city's layout and symbolism. The kings took full advantage of that opportunity. Their cities were carefully planned to express and reinforce the ideology of kingship. Among them, Akhatan stands out because it is the best documented. Both in its overall design and in the details of daily life, it gives us the clearest window into how a king's vision could be made physical, how the layout of a capital could serve as a political and religious message in stone. On the east bank of the Nile, the city of Akhatan was laid out in a long ribbon of official buildings that followed the river, all connected by a grand royal road about 30 meters wide. Temples and palaces stood side by side, and the city was designed to honor both the god Aten and the king, reflecting a deliberate blending of religious and royal authority. The city's layout was meant to emphasize the deep connection between the two. Akhatan was organized along a north-south axis, following the path of the royal road. The king's world was divided into 4 zones, each separated by ramps or gates: a residential zone in the north, a sacred zone, a secular administrative zone, and a recreational zone in the south. The king's palace, located at the northern edge of the city along the river, was his private residence. When he moved southward, he passed through the ceremonial palaces and the great temple of Aten in the sacred zone. At the heart of the city stood the king's house, the administrative center with nearby offices. Finally, in the south, temples, surrounded by gardens and pools, offered spaces for rest and relaxation. This planned progression through the city paralleled the movement of the sun across the sky. Just as the sun rose in the east, the king emerged from his northern palace. Midday, when the sun reached its peak, corresponded to the king's appearance in the king's house, where he would address his people from the window of appearances. Like the sun, the king was seen as a source of light, prosperity, and order, driving away darkness and chaos. As the sun set, both god and king withdrew, taking their beneficent powers with them. In this way, Akhatan was not just a city, it symbolized the cosmos itself. Akhenaten may have taken the fusion of god and king to an unusual extreme, but the core idea behind it was deeply rooted in Egyptian kingship. The king was not just the god's representative, he was considered the son of the sun god. For example, Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, worked hard to promote the story of her divine birth, claiming that Amun-Re had visited her mother in the form of Thutmose, the first to conceive her. Egyptian kings were believed to become gods after death, and some, like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II Evan, had cults dedicated to them during their lifetimes. While the degree to which living kings were regarded as divine is still debated, the close connection between king and god is undeniable, and Akhetaten made that connection visible and tangible like no other place in Egypt. The other new capital cities of the late Bronze Age reflected the same fundamental idea as Akhetaten, the close connection between king and god. In each of them, temples and palaces were placed in the heart of the city, reinforcing the symbolic and practical bond between divine power and royal authority. While the nature of that relationship varied across cultures and changed over time, the underlying concept was shared. Egypt gives us the richest documentation for this idea. But we do have evidence from elsewhere. In Assyria, for instance, a text from the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I describes his coronation ritual. As the king entered the temple, the high priest of the god Ashur declared, "Ashur is king! Ashur is king!" This proclamation meant that the god became king at the same moment the human ruler took power, and it was on behalf of the god that the mortal king ruled. Yet the king was not just an ordinary person. Assyrian rulers like Tukulti-Ninurta adopted titles such as sun god of the land. While they were not literally gods, they were considered far closer to the divine than any other human. The title sun, or sun god, was widely used by powerful rulers of the time. Vassals in Syria, for example, regularly addressed the pharaoh of Egypt as "my son," the sun from the sky. In one letter, Abimelchu, the king of Tyre, described the Egyptian king in exalted terms. "My lord is the sun, rising over the lands each day." Following the destiny of the sun, his gracious father, who gives life with his sweet breath and returns, with his north wind, who holds the whole earth in peace by the power of his arm. In doing so, Abimelchu reflected the Egyptian belief that the pharaoh was the son of the sun god, or even the sun god incarnate. Similarly, the Hittite kings adopted the title "my son," especially during the second half of the second millennium. Despite the different religions and deities in Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite world, all three cultures gave the sun god a central role, a pattern echoed in many other ancient civilizations. One of the sun god's most important duties was the preservation of cosmic order. Egyptian texts illustrate this vividly. In their view, darkness allowed chaos to roam, while sunrise restored peace and order. A hymn to Aten, the sun disk god, describes this vividly. "When you are in the western light land, earth is in darkness, in the condition of death. The sleepers are in their chambers, heads covered. One eye does not see the other. If they were robbed of the goods beneath their heads, they would not know it. Every lion leaves its den. All the serpents bite. Darkness is a grave. Earth is silent until the Creator returns to the land of light." In this view, the sun was not just a celestial body. It was the force that kept the world from falling into chaos. And in the ideology of kingship across the region, the king mirrored the sun, bringing light, order, and life to the land. The situation completely changed once the sun rose and brought light back to the world. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians believed that the sun had a positive life-giving force. In hymns to the sun god Shamash, they praised him for ensuring justice and safety, reflecting a widespread belief across ancient cultures in the sun's power to sustain order. For the Egyptians and, for many others, the universe was governed by two opposing forces, order and chaos. It was the responsibility of both gods and humans to defend order. The Egyptians had a word for this concept, Mahat. Mahat was a complex idea encompassing justice, truth, proper social behavior, and even Egypt's supremacy over other nations. Order was never taken for granted. It was fragile and constantly threatened, symbolized by the image of a delicate feather. Although everyone was expected to support Mahat, it was the king's duty above all to uphold it. As the most powerful and divinely connected human, only the king had the authority and tools to fully enforce it. Every new reign was seen as a renewal of creation, a time when chaos was once again pushed back and order restored heaven. If Egypt had been stable for years, it's why many new kingdom pharaohs opened their reigns with declarations that they had defeated chaos. Regardless of whether actual conflict had occurred, during Akhenaten's rule, the concept of Maat evolved. It became closely tied to the sun god Aten, reflecting the unique religious ideas of the time. But even outside this unusual period, Mahat and the sun god were always linked in Egyptian thought. The king's responsibilities, whether leading campaigns abroad or managing justice at home, were understood as earthly reflections of what the sun god did in the heavens. This principle wasn't exclusive to Egypt. In Assyria, the king was also seen as responsible for maintaining cosmic order, mirroring the sun god's daily journey across the sky, which banished darkness and upheld stability. ***, founding a new city. in this worldview was more than just a political or logistical act. It was a symbolic moment of creating order from chaos. Akhenaten is especially significant in this regard. Under Akhenaten's ideology, Maat was seen as a universal force, and the city's construction reflected that belief. But the idea extended beyond Egypt, across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were seen as islands of order surrounded by a dangerous and chaotic countryside. The physical presence of fortified walls served not only to protect residents from external threats, but also to symbolize the triumph of order over the disorder of the wilderness. In essence, founding a city was akin to recreating the world anew, a small-scale version of the original act of creation itself. There are many ways to explore the concept of kingship in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BCE. The topic is far too complex to cover fully here. However, one striking trend from this period, the founding of at least 5 new capital cities within a relatively short time, offers a unique insight into the ambitions of certain kings. In several states, rulers pushed the limits of their power by building entirely new capitals, often naming them after themselves and filling them with grand temples and palaces. These cities served to reinforce the king's divine role and his close association with the gods, who were seen as the guarantors of order in the world. In creating these new capitals, kings deliberately turned away from older, traditional centers of power, places that for centuries had been the heart of religious and political life. These new cities, sometimes called disembedded capitals, had no pre-existing institutional or social foundation. Establishing them required not only a vast redirection of resources, but also a reshuffling of political hierarchies. Long established, elite families in cities like Ashur, Babylon, Susa, Memphis, and Thebes, families who had traditionally supplied the priests and top officials, found themselves displaced or replaced by newcomers. This disruption was especially clear in the case of Akhenaten. His reforms went further than most, marginalizing the old religious and bureaucratic establishment. While his actions were unusually radical, it would be a mistake to assume that other kings' initiatives met no resistance. It's likely that, in every case, powerful groups resented the king's efforts to shift the balance of power. These rulers didn't just want to strengthen their position. They aimed to fundamentally rewrite the structure of authority. But these grand ambitions did not always last. The capitals founded by Akhenaten and Tukulti-Ninurta lost their significance soon after their founders died. Akhenaten's religious revolution was quickly undone, and later Egyptians came to view his reign as a time when cosmic and social order had been lost. As for Tukulti-Ninurta, he was eventually assassinated. Although his death is not directly linked to the creation of his capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, it seems clear that he lost the support of his people. Toward the end of his life, he grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. In one psalm to the gods, he gave voice to his fears. All the evildoers await a dark day without sunshine. Their threatening fingers are stretched out to scatter the armies of Assur. Vilely they plot evil against their benefactor. These words suggest a king who felt betrayed and isolated, a powerful reminder that even the most ambitious rulers could not always impose their vision without consequences. There are many ways to explore the idea of kingship in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BCE, and the topic is far too complex to fully cover here. However, the sudden appearance of at least 5 newly founded capital cities during this time reveals something significant about the ambitions of certain kings. In several regions, rulers pushed their pursuit of absolute power to the extreme. By building cities named after themselves and filling them with temples and palaces, they sought to tie their own identities more closely to the gods and to the divine role of maintaining cosmic order. These kings turned away from long-established capitals that had, for centuries, symbolized the traditional connection between kingship and the gods. Instead, they created what scholars call disembedded capitals, entirely new cities, with no previous institutional or social foundations. In practical terms, these new cities demanded the redirection of massive resources that otherwise would have gone to older centers. Ideologically, they disrupted the prestige and influence of the traditional elites. Prominent families in cities like Ashur, Babylon, Susa, Memphis, and Thebes families who had long provided priests and high officials were pushed aside or replaced by newcomers. This shift was especially apparent in the case of Akhenaten, whose reforms clearly marginalized the old religious and bureaucratic class, though his actions may have been unusually radical. It's unlikely that other rulers' efforts to reshape power dynamics were welcomed by the established elites either. These kings seem to have deliberately challenged the status quo and sought to restructure the existing order, but the fate of these new cities shows that royal power was not as all-powerful as their founders may have imagined. Akhenaten's capital and the city of Tukulti-Ninurta quickly lost their importance after the king's deaths. Akhenaten's reforms were reversed. The Egyptians came to view his reign as a time when Matatha, ideal of cosmic and social order, had been broken. Tukulti-Ninurta was eventually assassinated. Though historical sources don't directly link this to his founding of Kartakelti-Ninurta, still there are signs that his people grew disillusioned with him, and near the end of his life he may have become paranoid. In a psalm addressed to the gods, he confided his fears. All the evildoers await a dark day without sunshine. Their threatening fingers are stretched out to scatter the armies of Ashur. Vilely they plot evil against their benefactor. Other newly founded capitals on to Shensu perish. Dur-Kurigalzu and Per-Ramesses lasted longer, but they never truly replaced the traditional political centers. Over time, Susa, Babylon, Memphis, and Thebes once again dominated, overshadowing these newer cities. This pattern shows that royal authority, while powerful, was not absolute. Kings relied on support, but not from the general population. Their power rested instead on a narrow elite, one that shared many features across the different societies of the Late Bronze Age. Asterisk. When Untashnaparisha and other kings moved their courts to newly built capitals, they intentionally disrupted the existing balance of power in their kingdoms. These moves were driven by self-interest acts in which the king and a hand-picked group of courtiers abandoned established cities that had long been political centers, relocating instead to remote, uninhabited areas for those who had once had easy access to the court. This sudden shift made reaching the king much more difficult. The court became isolated, retreating into its own separate world. These relocations reflected a model of kingship that valued seclusion and separation from the general population, not a ruler who stayed connected with his people. Building new capitals was just the most visible expression of a broader pattern seen throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age. Kings and their elites set themselves apart from the rest of society, creating distinct and exclusive spaces. This is evident in the layout of royal cities everywhere, whether ruled by powerful empires or smaller kingdoms. In every case, certain neighborhoods were clearly reserved for the privileged few. In some cities, the quarters inhabited by rulers and their inner circles were outright fortresses. In Mycenaean Greece, citadels surrounded by massive Cyclopean stone walls may have offered protection from foreign invaders, but they also reinforced the separation between rulers and ordinary people. Across the Aegean, in central Anatolia, the Hittite king lived in similar conditions. Hattusa spanned a large area and was enclosed within a defensive wall. Access to the so-called upper city where the main temples were located was tightly controlled through a series of fortified gates, some of them adorned with sculpted figures. Within this already well-defended city, the royal compound stood, even more isolated. Today, the site is still called Bikakal in Turkish, meaning Great Fortress. The citadel was built on a separate mountain outcrop, with steep ravines on its northern and eastern sides. A massive wall enclosed the entire complex, and entry was limited to just 3 heavily fortified gates. The geography of Greece and central Anatolia allowed rulers to build their citadels on mountain peaks, making them naturally defensible and separate from the surrounding population. But even in regions without such dramatic landscapes like other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, rulers still found ways to physically distance themselves from their subjects. In cities like Ugarit, Imar, and Carchemish in Syria, the royal quarters were built on elevated ground within the cities and enclosed by walls. In the Assyrian capital of Assur, the fortified old town home to the palace temples, an elite residences was built on higher ground and separated from the rest of the city by a massive wall with 3 fortified gates. The general population lived in the new town below. We don't have much direct evidence about how accessible these kings were, but it seems clear that very few people could approach them. For instance, the Assyrians left behind a set of decrees that tightly controlled access to the palace women, who lived in seclusion with no freedom of movement. While these restrictions likely stemmed from social norms around gender and sexuality, they also point to a guarded and inaccessible court. Similarly, a long Hittite protocol outlines the duties of the royal bodyguards. Though focused on ritual and security, it reinforces the idea that access to the king was tightly restricted. The broader structure of late Bronze Age societies in the Eastern Mediterranean is still not fully understood, because most of the surviving records come from royal institutions like palaces and temples. It can appear as though kings controlled every aspect of life. Some scholars have gone so far as to argue that these societies revolved entirely around the royal household, and that other elite families were connected to the king in a network that functioned like an extended family. This idea aligns with Max Weber's patrimonial household model, however. A more balanced view sees these societies as divided into 2 main sectors, one that was attached to the palace and one that was not. The palace sector did dominate societal, politically, economically, and religiously, but alongside it was a village sector made up of independent rural communities. These villagers lived on land. They farmed as family units under the leadership of local elders. Their communities were generally egalitarian, and the people were mostly poor. Because their social and economic life was relatively simple, they didn't need complex bureaucracies, and as a result, they rarely show up in official records except when they interacted with palace institutions. In some areas, these independent village communities were more prominent than in others, but everywhere they seemed to face growing pressure and encroachment from the palace. Sector 1 example that reveals the collapse of independent village. Life comes from a region on the eastern edge of the Mitanni state, near the city of Nuzi. This small city was part of the kingdom of Arafa, located east of the Tigris River, and its king was a vassal of Mitanni. The archives from Nuzi, dating to the 15th century BCE, belonged to wealthy members of the palace elite who were eager to profit from agricultural land, but faced legal restrictions that made this difficult. In that region, land wasn't individually owned. Instead, it was held jointly by families, and outright sales of land were either forbidden or heavily restricted to get around these rules. Some wealthy men came up with a legal loophole. They had themselves adopted by local villagers. In return for a gift, essentially a disguised purchase price, the elite adoptees received the right to use the family's land. One man named Tehiptila did this around 50 times, acquiring control over a vast amount of farmland. The villagers who adopted him often did so out of desperation, weighed down by debt. In exchange for settling those debts, Tehiptila took over their fields while allowing them to remain as tenant farmers. In this way, he gained access to both the land and the labor that worked it. Through these tactics, he and others like him, wealthy clients of the palace, were able to undermine or even erase the independence of rural communities. During the late Bronze Age, the palace sector was far more powerful and extensive than the village sector. Scale and complexity dominate the historical record. In major states like Egypt and Babylonia, this had been true for centuries. Palace institutions absorbed most of the population into their networks. The development of large-scale irrigation systems, managed by the palace and fed by canal networks, helped concentrate economic power and further centralize control. This pattern held throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Everywhere, palaces controlled the economy and society, and they thrived until the eventual collapse of the Late Bronze Age system. These palace-centered societies were strictly hierarchical. A person's position was determined by birth and profession. Most people worked in specialized roles, often inherited from their fathers, providing services to the palace, whether in the bureaucracy, the military, or religious institutions. The majority of the population, however, were farmers and manual laborers tied to the land. While they weren't slaves in the legal sense, they weren't owned outright by a person or institution they had limited freedom of movement and were obligated to provide goods and services to the palace. The upper levels of society lived in the cities, and those at the very top made up the king's inner circle. These elite individuals were likely the only ones allowed to live within the fortified citadels. They held power primarily in three areas of government: the military, administration, and religion. All three branches involved large numbers of people, though we don't know exactly how many. Each one had a detailed hierarchy, with many ranks and titles. These varied from culture to culture and evolved over time, so we won't explore them in depth here. It's important to note that the titles people held often didn't reflect their actual duties. For example, the Hittite official known as the chief of the wine may originally have been a palace wine steward, but by the late 2nd millennium BCE, he had become a high-ranking military commander in charge of leading campaigns. This kind of title inflation was common across history. Terms that began in a household setting were retained even as the roles became powerful positions in state governance. The titles themselves don't tell us how far the power of their holders had expanded, despite cultural differences. There were many similarities in government structures across the Eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age. Every state maintained a military not just for defense, but often for expansion or plunder. Warfare played a central role in diplomacy and statecraft, and the army became a major arm of government. Most men were drafted to fight as part of the services they owed the palace. Military campaigns typically took place in the summer, after the harvest, when food could be gathered more easily along the way. Military technology had advanced significantly by this time. In the mid-2nd millennium BCE, a major innovation arrived in the Near East: the two-wheeled, horse-drawn chariot, likely introduced from northern regions. By the start of the Late Bronze Age, every army included a chariot division, staffed by professional soldiers. Charioteers needed extensive training and skill, far more than the foot soldiers of earlier times. Their role was to ride to the front lines and fire arrows from a stationary position. Their only defense was a shield-bearer, who may also have wielded a spear. Chariots were expensive and complex. Each one needed not only materials to build, but to horses to pull at hand, usually one or two backup horses. A team of technicians was also required to maintain the chariots, though they were relatively few in number, perhaps one chariot per 100 infantrymen. They were a vital part of the army. The men who operated them belonged to the upper military ranks. In Syria, these elite charioteers were known as Marianu, a word that may come from the same root as a Vedic term meaning young man. Marianu were especially important in the armies of Mitanni and the smaller states in the Syro-Palestinian region. Over time, their elite status extended beyond the military. Marianu came to refer to members of the upper class in general, not just to soldiers. Warfare played a central role in international politics during the Late Bronze Age, since many states controlled foreign territories and were frequently involved in military conflict. Nearly all major powers, and likely many smaller ones, as well maintained standing armies made up of professional soldiers. Alongside these full-time troops were conscripts and mercenaries, often recruited from marginalized groups on the fringes of society, such as the Habiru mentioned earlier in Chapter 3. It's extremely difficult to determine the actual size of these armies based on the historical records that have survived. Kings often exaggerated enemy numbers to make their victories sound more impressive, something that still happens today, such as in modern claims about the size of the Iraqi army. Even so, scholars have tried to estimate military sizes from such accounts. For example, the Hittite army at the famous Battle of Kadesh has been estimated at around 47,500 men. A recent study of warfare in New Kingdom Egypt suggests that the Egyptian regular army probably did not exceed 40,000 troops. That estimate is based on the assumption that, in a population of about 3 million, roughly 1% could serve as full-time soldiers. Around 30,000 men with another. 10,000 drawn from conscripts serving a third of the year. These numbers are highly speculative, as they depend on a lot of uncertain data. Also, these estimates often don't include support staff, which would have been substantial. Every army relied on a wide range of non-combat personnel, servants, craftsmen, cooks, and others who handled logistics and daily needs. Asterisk, like all armies throughout history, these forces were structured according to a strict hierarchy. While the titles of ranks have survived in some cases, their exact functions are often unclear. There was some room for promotion based on merit. In the autobiography, inscribed in his tomb, the Egyptian soldier Amos, son of Abana, described how he was promoted to the rank of warrior of the ruler after demonstrating bravery in battle. Soldiers who excelled in the infantry sometimes advanced into the elite chariot divisions. Still, we don't have enough evidence to reconstruct a typical career path for soldiers in any army of the period. Promotions to the highest ranks were rarely based on ability alone. Family connections played a decisive role. In every major state, the king served as commander-in-chief. The top military positions just below him were usually filled by his relatives. In Hittite society, for instance, the crown prince held the second highest military rank, and the king's brother often served as commander of the royal bodyguards. This blending of dynastic privilege and military authority wasn't unusual and, in many ways, it mirrors practices that still exist in modern times. The main difference is that ancient kings were often personally involved in battle. Unlike today's commanders-in-chief, who typically remained far from the front lines, in the late Bronze Age, military men from modest backgrounds could rise to powerful positions in other areas of government. In Egypt, it was common for successful military officers to transition into high-ranking roles in the civil bureaucracy, something that rarely happened the other way around. Though uncommon, even the throne was not out of reach. During times of crisis, generals occasionally seized power. As seen with Harmhab and Ramesses I, after the instability following Akhenaten's reign, since being a warrior was considered a vital trait for a ruler, it made sense to the Egyptians that a capable military leader could also become king. Even lower-level government positions were open to experienced military men, and across the Eastern Mediterranean world, they often held considerable political influence. Just like the military, the civil government had many officials with specialized titles, though their exact responsibilities are often unclear today. These ancient states were highly centralized and complex, and the palaces oversaw most economic activity. Their economies worked on a redistributive model. The palace collected surplus resources, usually food and goods, from those working the land, and then redistributed those resources to state dependents. These dependents were often specialists, such as artisans or officials, who couldn't grow their own food because of their professional duties. Although we can't precisely measure how much land or food was involved or how many people were part of the system, we know it operated on a large scale. For example, the granaries at the Ramesseum in western Thebes could hold over 16.5 million liters of grain. If fully distributed, that amount could feed around 3,400 families, or about 17,000 to 20,000 people for a whole year. Running a redistributive economy like this required a large, organized bureaucracy. Officials had to keep track of resources, assess what each person owed or contributed, and be held accountable if something went missing. These bureaucrats themselves were carefully monitored by supervisors, and the entire system needed oversight from someone at the top to ensure it all functioned smoothly. In Egypt, each government office had a very specific role, usually focusing on one task, such as quarrying, transport, or tax collection. And this kind of specialization probably existed in other states of the region too. Senior administrators often oversaw multiple offices to coordinate their work. A good example of such a high-ranking official is the vizier, one of the top positions in the Egyptian government. His responsibilities are listed in a text called The Duties of the Vizier, carved into several tomb walls. A modern scholar summarized the vizier's role like this: his job dealt almost entirely with administrative matters, maintaining civil order, overseeing taxes, managing archives and record-keeping, appointing and supervising officials, handling land disputes and property claims, inspecting local governments, monitoring natural events such as the Nile flood and crop conditions, and above all, administering civil law. In short, the vizier's role was both vast and highly detailed, and reflects the complexity of centralized government in the Late Bronze Age. Although all the major states in the Eastern Mediterranean shared similar government structures, they also had many differences, often based on their size and historical development. Among them, Egypt likely had the most complex bureaucracy. The country had a long tradition of centralized government and detailed record-keeping. And during the second half of the second millennium BCE, it revived and expanded that administrative system. The new kingdom's territorial expansion, especially into regions like Kush-Nubia, meant that Egypt had to manage new lands and increase the number of administrators. Since the Egyptians considered Nubia an integral part of their kingdom, they had to adjust their traditional division of Egypt into Upper and Lower Egypt. They created a new post, the king's son of Kush, to serve as the chief administrator of Nubia. At the other end of the spectrum, the Mycenaean principalities had the simplest bureaucracies. Their system of writing and record-keeping had only recently developed. The linear B script was fully adopted in Crete around 1430 BCE and spread to the Greek mainland later. These palaces ruled over smaller areas and had fewer people to manage directly. Their bureaucracies were small and mostly consisted of officials, known as collectors, who handled palace affairs and ensured resources flowed into the central administration. We don't have complete documentation from any of these societies that would allow us to fully reconstruct their administrative hierarchies, just as it would likely be difficult for someone thousands of years from now to understand the entire structure of a modern government. Still, it's clear that these ancient civil services were large and complex, and they required people with very specific training. Running a bureaucracy requires people who can read and write, skills we often take for granted today, but in the largely illiterate societies of the Late Bronze Age, literacy was rare. Those who were trained as scribes were highly respected and held important roles. An Egyptian saying captured the benefits of being a scribe: be a scribe, so that your limbs will be sleek and your hands will grow soft, that you may go forth in white clothes and be honored with courtiers saluting you. Scribes were sometimes the only professionals to sign their work, in contrast to artists, sculptors, or even authors, who typically remained anonymous. In the Near East, Babylonian traditions dominated scribal culture, and Babylonian trained scribes often traveled to foreign courts, where they likely held prestigious positions. Scribal education was usually institutionalized, but took place in private homes, and the role of scribe often passed from father to son. However, it's unclear how many government officials were actually literate. In Egypt, high-ranking officials often listed scribe among their titles, suggesting they could read and write. But this wasn't the case in other cultures. It's very possible that many senior officials, like viziers or overseers of granaries, didn't read the reports themselves, but instead relied on professional secretaries to interpret and relay the information. Just like in the military, there was no fixed path for rising through the ranks in the bureaucracy. Some Egyptian officials who reached high office claimed to have come from humble beginnings, though that might have been a common storytelling device rather than the truth. While skill and experience may have played a role in their advancement, one thing was certain: the king's favor was essential. Every appointment came directly from the king, and he could revoke it at any time. Loyalty was a highly valued trait. In Hittite society, officials had to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. The idea that one served the king personally, not the state, was clearly demonstrated in Assyrian coronation rituals. Asterisk, when a new king came to power, high officials would symbolically lay down the tools of their office in front of him. The high and second viziers would set down their staffs. The chief of finances would place his purse. The chief musician would present his harp, and all others offered whatever symbol represented their position. Then they would step aside, and the king would say, "Everyone keeps his post." They would bow, approach, and reclaim their positions. The king allowed it. Despite the formal process, many top offices stayed within powerful families for generations. Just like in royal courts throughout history, those close to the king or queen often arranged for their sons, daughters, or relatives to take over their roles. These elite families not only worked near the king, they lived close to him too. Often in restricted access areas inside the fortified citadels, their homes often had private archives, allowing us today to trace their roles and personal lives. One good example is the Urad Shirua family of Assur. Their house, it's only about 100 meters from the palace, contained records from 3 generations of the family. They had managed grain distribution in the Upper Habur region of Syria. As powerful administrators, they received visits and gifts from people hoping to win their favor, including bribes like slaves. The family kept meticulous records of both these dealings and their personal affairs, such as house sales and loans, in what seems to have been their own home. This practice wasn't unusual. Many Near Eastern cities archaeologists have found similar household archives combining private and professional documents, such as at Ugarit. This blend of personal and official record-keeping was common throughout the region, not something new or unique to the Late Bronze Age. Alongside the palaces, temples were the largest and most important institutions in the Late Bronze Age, except in the Mycenaean world, where independent temples didn't exist. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were large estates, supporting the gods and the many people who served them. Just as the king was the head of the palace, the god was seen as the head of the temple. And a whole workforce of priests and laborers worked the temple's land and managed its resources. The domains of major temples could be vast, requiring many people and a system of administration to oversee it all. Because rituals were essential to kingship, and no ritual was complete without offerings, temples needed significant resources: food, drink, incense, and luxury items for the gods. Temples weren't separate from the state, they were deeply integrated into state structures. Their role was to ensure the gods remained favorable to the kingdom. The king himself was the chief priest. And in Egypt, for example, he was often depicted personally performing temple rituals. But the scale of religious activity meant that a large priesthood was necessary to serve the gods' daily needs. These priests held various roles and ranks. Some worked full-time, while others only served part-time in Egypt. The full-time temple staff were called servants of the god, often translated as prophets, a term borrowed from Greek. The part-time priests, known as the pure ones, were divided into 4 rotating groups, each serving for 1 month at a time. Although we don't have as much documentation for other Late Bronze Age states, similar systems likely existed. In Babylonia, for instance, temple workers had long been a mix of full and part-timers, and there's no reason to believe this changed in the later period. For many people, getting a job in the temple wasn't just a religious calling, it was a practical and economic decision. Being a priest meant receiving a share of the temple's offerings, known as prebends. Even a small share was enough to provide a stable supply of food and drink. Those with money often bought temple positions as a way to secure long-term income and social status. In theory, the king appointed all the priests, but in reality, this was often just a formality. Local officials likely chose the regional temple. Staff and priestly positions tended to stay in families. Sons often succeeded their fathers. Like other branches of government, temples had a complex hierarchy of positions, and people could work their way up. One well-documented case is that of Bacon Khans, an Egyptian from the 13th century BCE, who described his long and distinguished career in several inscriptions. He spent 4 years as a student, then 11 years working in the royal stables under King Seti I. He became a low-ranking priest for 4 years, before joining the group of Amun's prophets. Over time, he steadily rose through the ranks: 12 years as a regular prophet, 15 as a third-ranking prophet, 12 more as second-ranking, and then at least 27 years as the high priest of Amun. By the time he died, he had served in the temple for about 70 years. While his career length might have been unusual and possibly exaggerated, it's likely that many high-ranking priests were experienced professionals with considerable personal influence. Our modern, Distinction between the military, civil, and religious sectors doesn't quite fit the ancient world. People often moved between these spheres or held roles in more than one at once. For instance, Egyptian military leaders sometimes ended their careers in civil administration. Still, the practice of elite officials collecting multiple titles, common feature in earlier times, seems to have faded as roles became more specialized. They demanded people with specific training and experience. Technically, the king had the power to appoint or remove anyone from office, but in practice, his choices were probably limited by local politics and traditions. However, kings could and did override local hierarchies when they wanted. For example, early in his reign, Ramesses II appointed Nebuninef, a priest from Middle Egypt, as the new high priest of Amun in Thebes. This likely disrupted the local elite, who may have expected one of their own to be promoted. To keep his government stable, the king needed to ensure that his officials remained loyal and satisfied. This was easier when the kingdom was economically prosperous and militarily successful. Victory in war benefited all levels of government. High-ranking military officers often welcomed warfare, gave them more power, responsibility, and resources, not to mention prestige. Even regular soldiers stood to gain from victory. The autobiography of Amos, son of Abana, tells how, after proving his bravery in battle, he was rewarded with gold, slaves, then land. In the late Bronze Age, war was nearly constant, making the military central to government life. Even in peacetime, the army likely held considerable political influence, thanks to its control over force and coercion. Civil servants also benefited when states expanded. As empires imposed their bureaucratic systems on new territories, they needed experienced administrators, usually only available from the heartland. These officials were dispatched to newly conquered regions, which expanded their careers and influence. For instance, the Assyrians established administrative centers in key areas across conquered Syrian territory and staffed them with officials from Assyria, deliberately isolating them from the local populations. Similarly, the Egyptians created towns in Nubia that housed administrators sent from Egypt. As the state's wealth and territory grew, so did its need for bureaucratic oversight. More income and goods required more officials to manage them, which increased the power and importance of the civil service. But perhaps the greatest beneficiaries of imperial success were the temples. The close relationship between gods and kings meant that every royal act required divine approval. To maintain favor with the gods and with the powerful priesthoods, kings showered the temples with wealth. Across the region, excluding the Mycenaean world, which had no independent temples, kings built new temples or enlarged and renovated older ones. They donated elaborately crafted statues, furniture, ritual vessels, and other luxurious items. In Mesopotamia, where buildings were made mostly of mud brick, temples needed frequent repair. Although inscriptions about such projects are relatively scarce, many that do exist highlight work done on temples. In Egypt, temple construction during this period was particularly intense. The city of Thebes became covered with religious complexes. Nearly every ruler of the new kingdom added something to the great temple of Amun-Re at Karnak Chapel, a gate, an obelisk, or a statue. These projects were public statements of piety and power. For example, Queen Hatshepsut proudly described in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri how she carved, transported, and erected 4 monolithic obelisks in honor of Amun. New temples sprang up across Egypt and Nubia, particularly under rulers like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, who built them in large numbers. Temples also gained from military victories. As much of the spoils of war ended up in their treasuries, Tiglath-Pileser, an Assyrian king, repeatedly boasted in his annals about the valuable gifts he offered to the gods from conquered lands. Then I gave the god Ashur a bronze vat and a bronze bathtub taken from the booty and tribute of the land of Katmu. I gave the god Adad, who loves me, 60 copper kettles. These royal offerings, though grand, were still modest compared to what the Egyptians amassed over time. One notable example is found in a relief by Thutmose III ruled 1479 to 1425 BCE, carved on a wall at Karnak. It depicts the vast booty he presented to the god Ammon after his military campaigns in Syria. The items are shown in ranked registers based on their value, with the most valuable like gold depicted in the greatest detail. The gold alone amounted to over 13,800 kilograms in ingots, along with a wide array of intricately decorated vessels and boxes over the centuries. Egypt's temples must have accumulated incredible riches in their treasuries. However, these treasures were symbolic. They were meant to bring prestige to the temple and the king who donated them. The priests themselves didn't use this treasure directly. Instead, their wealth and daily needs came from the temple estates, especially their agricultural lands. Kings could secure priestly support by expanding these temple holdings. Asterisk once again. Egypt provides the clearest documentation. Ramesses IV ruled 1156 to 1150 BCE, left behind a long papyrus known as Papyrus Harrisai that recorded the vast donations. His father, Ramesses III, had made 2 temples. The scale is astonishing. Ramesses III granted 2,954 square kilometers of farmland, 2 temples across. Egypt about 15% of the country's total farmland. He also donated over 107,000 male laborers, which could have represented 3% of the total population when accounting. For their families, these temple dependents may have numbered close to 500,000 people. More than 80% of these donations went to the temples of Thebes. Based on this, many scholars believe that by this time, Egyptian temples controlled roughly 1/3 of all the land in the country. Temple estates were managed in several ways. As described in the later Papyrus Wilbur from the reign of Ramesses V, 1150 to 1145 BCE. According to this document, temple land was cultivated in 3 main ways: direct management by temple officials, who oversaw large farms. These officials collected 30% of the harvest for the temple's use, with the remaining 70% going toward costs like food rations for workers, leased land rented to small-scale farmers, who paid a modest 6% of their yield. As a fee, this helped sustain a large population likely made up of dependents of the state and temples, small plots assigned to temple officials, as a supplement to their rations and pay. This system allowed the king, as the supreme head of all government institutions, to reward his servants and officials with food, land, and gifts. The king was the central figure. Ideally, he provided for everyone. This ideal is illustrated in images from Akhenaten's reign, where at the window of appearances the king is shown showering his courtiers with gold, jewelry, and providing food and drink to the common people. In return, they pledged their loyalty and admiration. But the system only worked when the king had enough resources to support it. Egypt entered the new kingdom flush with wealth from military victories. Early on, the royal coffers overflowed. But later, as the Hittites gradually pushed Egypt out of its Asian territories, these resources began to shrink.